Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight. I'm Glenn Rawson. Welcome to this fireside. Now, this one's going to be a little bit different than most of the ones that I do because, this is airing on Sunday night. I'm en route out to Philadelphia right now to begin a church history tour. It's called the Ultimate Church History Tour with Fun for Less Tours, and there are 90 people with me. We're going out to cover church history all the way from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where we'll spend a couple of days on patriotic American history, and then we'll work our way all the way to Nauvoo and Carthage, Illinois, where we will talk about the history of the church in great detail, and I will share a lot of stories. So that's where I'm at as this fireside airs. I'm in Philadelphia, just fixing to start that tour. But I thought what I would do tonight, just for the fun of it, is that I would share with you some of the stories and the places that we'll be covering on this tour beginning in Philadelphia. So that's what I'm going to do. 7 stories tonight based on the locations where I'm going to take this group of people on tour. And so, you can see, obviously, I ask for your faith and prayers that there's something in one of these stories that might be of benefit to you. So here we go. First story. Thomas was born January the 29th, 1737, in Thetford, Norfolk, England, into a working class family. His father was a Quaker by religion and a corset maker by trade. Now, being a Quaker made him something of a rebel in English society. Maybe that's what shows up later. The family lived modestly, and Thomas's upbringing exposed him to the difficulties and struggles of a working class life. Growing up poor made Thomas acutely aware of social and economic inequalities that pervaded British class society. And it awakened in him, an empathy for the common working man. Didn't think they were fairly treated. Growing up as a Quaker also imbued Thomas with the belief that men were born to be equal. No one was above another, as the royalty, of course, saw themselves. Thomas's formal education ended when he was 13 years old, but that didn't stop him. It only fueled his desire to be self-taught. He studied literature, science, philosophy avidly. He was a self-taught man. In time, he followed his father into the business of making corsets, but that failed. Then he went to work as a tax collector, where he witnessed firsthand the heavy burden that taxation placed on the poor and working class people. This experience as a tax collector fueled his resentment of government corruption and the exploitation of ordinary working class citizens by the rich and powerful. He got fired as a tax collector because he was inciting trouble. So he took a position as an excise officer, but he was dismissed again in 1774 after campaigning to his bosses for higher wages for his fellow excise officers. Made him mad. During this time as an excise officer, Thomas joined a group called, fittingly, the Headstrong Club, a political and social group that engaged in spirited discussions about politics, philosophy, and reform. By now, Thomas, the failed businessman and bureaucrat, had become an intelligent and articulate radical who believed that government needed total reform. And then it happened. Thomas ran into an old man from America who recognized something in this young man great and useful. He gave the young firebrand a letter of recommendation and told him to go to America. He did. Shortly after that, in late 1774, Thomas arrived in Philadelphia, just as tensions between the American colonies and Britain were escalating. Thomas took a job as a newspaper editor and immediately aligned himself heart and soul with the cause of the American Revolution. He was a patriot, and he was to prove himself the man for the moment in time. By late 1775, Thomas could see what was happening all across the colonies. Indecision. Should we break from England? Should we reconcile? Should we just cow to the king and parliament? What should we do? Is it even possible to break away from England? At all levels, from the farm to the halls of Congress, Americans wrestled with the idea of independence. But they hadn't seen what Thomas had. They hadn't seen the corruption, the exploitation, and the inequality of class society. There was no question in Thomas's mind what had to be and what had to happen. So, Thomas, the articulate, well-written editor, sat down to write, and from his pen came one of the most influential pieces of literature in American history, a common pamphlet called, Common Sense. The Common Sense of Independence. It was written in plain, simple English, accessible to every American. It laid out the common sense and inevitability of independence, and it quickly became a bestseller and galvanized the resolve of America. It gave expression to what people believed but didn't know they did. And because of that, Americans in greater numbers decided to declare independence and threw themselves into the revolution with greater effort. 6 months later, the Declaration of Independence was declared and published. It was Thomas who first persuaded us as a nation that government comes of the people, by the people, and for the people. It was Thomas who reframed the conflict with England from a local scrap in Massachusetts against unjust taxes into an outright rebellion and an eternal quest for liberty and self-governance. That America didn't want to be treated fairly by England. She wanted to be free of her and an independent nation. All of that from Thomas. Thomas, the failed firebrand, fresh off the boat from England, who inspired America to fight all the way to independence, was Thomas Paine. And one more thing. That old American visiting England who saw something in young Thomas useful and worthwhile and told him to go to America? It was Benjamin Franklin. And I will tell you that story in Philadelphia where it happened. Next story. Let's move on because my tour will go from Philadelphia up to what used to be called Harmony, Pennsylvania. Today it's called Oakland, Pennsylvania. We'll go to the Priesthood Restoration Site and the home of Joseph and Emma Smith. February 1829. Notwithstanding the snow and the cold, Father Joseph Smith Sr., now in his 58th year, arrived in Harmony, Pennsylvania, in company with his son Samuel, to visit his other son, Joseph Smith Jr., and his wife, Emma. The work of translating the Book of Mormon was in progress, though progressing slowly. In the course of that visit in that humble home, Father Smith humbly desired to know what the Lord had for him to do. End of quote. Well, his son, Joseph the seer, inquired of the Lord, and this significant revelation came to Joseph Sr. Quote, "Now behold, a marvelous work is about to come forth among the children of men. Therefore, O ye that embark in the service of God, See that ye serve him with all your heart, might, mind, and strength, that ye may stand blameless before God at the last day. Therefore, if ye have desires to serve God, ye are called to the work. And it goes on. You know it today as Doctrine and Covenants, section 4, and missionaries still memorize it and quote it. Now, we have no record in the history of Father Smith's immediate reaction to that revelation. However, some months later, after the Book of Mormon was published, a Quaker man came to Joseph Smith Sr.'s home and announced that he had purchased a note or a debt against Father Smith, and now he was here to collect that debt. When Father Smith asked him why he had bought a debt which wasn't his own, the Quaker refused to answer. Father Smith offered him $6 towards the debt, promising that the rest would follow if the man would wait. The man's response is telling. No, he said, I will not wait 1 hour, and if you do not pay me immediately, you shall go forthwith to the jail, unless... And he ran to the fireplace and made violent gestures with his hands towards the fire. Unless you will burn up them books of Mormon. But if you'll burn them up, I'll forgive you the whole debt. End of quote. What would you do? To this, Father Joseph Smith Sr. answered decidedly, that I shall not do. Then, answered the Quaker, you shall go to the jail. And at this point, Lucy Mack Smith stepped in and offered her valuable gold beads that clearly and easily constituted the remainder of the debt. But the Quaker refused them. He called a constable waiting just outside, and they arrested Father Joseph Smith Sr. and took him off to jail. Along the way, Father Smith's captors made him another offer. They said, quote, the men by whom I was taken commenced using every possible argument to induce me to renounce the Book of Mormon, saying how much better it would be for you to deny that silly thing than to be disgraced and imprisoned when you might not only escape but also have the note back as well as the money you have paid on it. End of quote. Again, Father Smith refused the offer, and he was taken to the jail and locked in a cell with a murderer and kept there for the next 30 days. While a prisoner in the jail, Father Smith kept the faith and preached the restored gospel to the inmates, and upon his release, baptized 2 into the church. In that revelation first given to Father Smith in 1829, 2 qualities are mentioned twice as qualifying one for the work of God. Notwithstanding his weakness, those characteristics seem to characterize the remainder of the days of Joseph Smith Sr. And what were they? Faith and charity. Section 4 had an impact on Joseph Smith Sr. the rest of his days. Now, once we leave Harmony, Pennsylvania, and there are many, many more stories I will tell when we get to Harmony, including the restoration of the priesthood, the visit of John the Baptist, the baptism, the translation of the Book of Mormon, all of that will come while we're there. But from there, we'll go up to the Joseph Knight home, the Josiah Stoll home, and yes, there are stories I can tell you there, but from there, we'll go to Fayette, New York, the home of the Whitmer family. And that's where this story takes place. May 1829, Harmony, Pennsylvania. Joseph Smith Jr. sat down with the scribe Oliver Cowdery to begin the work of translating the Book of Mormon. As he picked up the Urim and Thummim, he was not given the words of the Book of Mormon, but rather he was given instructions on the Urim and Thummim to write a letter to David Whitmer of Fayette, New York, asking David to come down and get them and take them to his house to finish the work of translating the Book of Mormon, as people in Harmony, including family, were trying to destroy Joseph and stop the work. Well, Joseph, as instructed, wrote the letter. When David received that letter, he showed it to his family, who reminded him of the critical need to get the wheat crop sown and fertilized before he left. David's father advised him to take the matter to the Lord and get a witness from him of the need and urgency. David prayed on the matter and was instructed of the Lord to sow his fields first and then go get the prophet. He then asked the Lord to enable him, David, to do this work sooner than the same work he had done before on the farm. In other words, help me to do the work faster, and that he would take that as an evidence that it was the will of God for him to engage in forwarding the work which was begun by Joseph Smith. End of quote. Well, David went out to plow. He had about 20 acres to plow. He concluded he would finish the plowing and then he would go. David later recorded, quote, "One morning I got up as usual to go to work. On going to the field, I found between 5 and 7 acres of my ground had been plowed during the night. I don't know who did it, but it was done, just as I would have done it myself, and the plow was left standing in the furrow." End of quote. Well, not only did David receive heavenly assistance in his fields, but he was enabled by his own power to accomplish more than he even considered possible. This to him was a witness that he was indeed called of God to assist Joseph in the work. David told his father, who had to see for himself, and having seen the miracle, Father Whitmer declared, "There must be some overruling power in this thing, and I think you'd better go as soon as you get your plaster of Paris sown and bring up the man with his scribe." End of quote. Plaster of Paris is fertilizer. Well, the next morning, David went out to scatter the fertilizer. Lucy Mack Smith tells the story. When he came to look for it, behold, it had entirely disappeared. Every vestige of it was gone from the spot where he'd left it. He ran to his sister's house a few yards distance and inquired if she knew anything of what had become of the plaster of Paris, which he had deposited near there. "Why," said she in surprise, "you sowed it all yesterday." "The children came and begged me to go out and look at some men that were sowing plaster in the field, for said they, 'Mother, you never saw anybody sow plaster as fast as they do in your life.' I went," she said, this is David's sister, "I went and I did see 3 men to work in the field as the children said. But supposing that you had employed some assistance because of your hurry to get your work done, I passed into the house without giving any further attention to the subject." End of quote. Well, David asked around, but he could not figure out who had done it. And as he related that circumstance to his father was at much of a loss to determine how this thing was brought about as it was. But there was no doubt upon the minds of the Whitmer family of an exertion of supernatural power connected with the operation, and all hands went to work to prepare David for the journey. David went on his way towards Harmony. And in 2 days, now mind you, figure this out. In 2 days, he went all the way from Fayette, New York, to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and did it without injuring his horses in the least, and it was a distance of 135 miles. I witness to you, the Book of Mormon is an undeniable miracle, not only in what it is, what it contains, but in how it came to be and the awesome power it has over the hearts of the children of men. End of story. Now, once we leave there, we're going to go further north and east up to the Hill Cumorah, where I will tell this story. April the 10th, 1815, Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in the Indonesian archipelago erupted explosively, ejecting some 38 cubic miles of material 27 miles straight up into the stratosphere and blocking out the sun for 2 days at a distance of 370 miles. Tambora remains the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The explosion blew off more than 4,700 feet off the top of the mountain and left a crater more than 4 miles across. The explosion was heard 1,600 miles away. The pyroclastic flow of the lava spread out 12 miles in all directions and buried the village of Tambora, freezing in time all the inhabitants thereof beneath some 10 feet of material. Tsunamis caused by Tambora reached a height of 13 feet and slammed into the surrounding islands, killing thousands. Altogether, it is estimated that Mount Tambora killed 71,000 people, and some 12,000 of those were killed directly by the eruption. Explosions and aftershocks went on for years. High-altitude ash went way up into and was carried by the prevailing winds around the globe, causing all kinds of phenomenon, optical phenomenon, and changes in the weather, prolonged and brilliant sunsets, stunning twilights, sunspots, and red fog, and many other things. And as I said, it changed the weather globally. You want to talk about global warming? Let's talk about a moment of global cooling. The summer of 1816 became known as the year without a summer. For example, on June the 4th, all across the New England states, there came a killer frost. June 4th. Snow fell up to a foot in some places. The cold lasted throughout the summer and ruined most agricultural crops. Not only that, but the 1810s became the coldest decade on record. Tambora went on to disrupt the lives of millions across the globe, destroying crops, intensifying diseases, causing famines, riots, and countless deaths. And among all of those suffering was one family I would like to discuss. Their livelihood was shattered by a lone explosive mountain on the other side of the world. The father planted his crops 3 times in that New England summer, and all 3 times they failed. He was ruined. He'd had enough of the rugged weather of Vermont. He knew nothing about the volcano. He would go elsewhere and seek his fortune. And he heard about newly opened land to the south and to the west. Accordingly, he picked up his family and moved to upstate New York to a brand new little village called Palmyra. And by so doing, that ruined farmer brought his young son, Joseph Smith Jr., to within 2 miles of a hill called Cumorah. Sometimes God's plan calls for things to happen that aren't comfortable, that are not convenient, and look like tragedy. Okay. Now, I couldn't resist. Now, if I could take you to the top of the Hill Cumorah, I would tell you this story. The year was 1901, when friends invited a young college student living in Oslo, Norway, to a concert sponsored by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The young man was impressed, and he started going to church meetings. Not long after, he was baptized. Now, this young man was a gifted art major and was offered, imagine this, a scholarship to study art in Rome. But instead of going to Rome to study under the masters, in 1905, he chose to immigrate to Utah. Once he got here to Utah, his talent was recognized, and he was commissioned over the years to do work on such places as the Salt Lake Tabernacle, the Salt Lake Temple, the temples in Hawaii, Alberta, Idaho Falls, Mesa, Los Angeles. It is very likely that in your travels, you have seen and admired the sculpture and artistry of Torleif Kanapus. Now, when the church acquired the Smith family farm in the Hill Cumorah in 1928, Torleif felt impressed that some kind of a monument needed to be raised to commemorate the beginnings of the restoration on that sacred mount. Accordingly, on his own accord, he prepared 7 sketches of a statue to be raised on the Hill Cumorah. Not certain which one it should be, one night in 1929, he climbed to the top of Ensign Peak in Salt Lake City. He spread the sketches out on the ground before him, and then he prayed to know if he was doing the right thing. Would the brethren accept his idea of raising a monument on Cumorah? And if it was a good idea, which of the sketches was the right one? Quoting now, when Torleif opened his eyes, there was a light all around him, and he could see every one of the 7 sketches, even though it was dark. And then he saw an angel pointing with his finger to the one that he thought was the best, and he heard the angel say, "This is the one." And then Torleif asked, "How will I approach the brethren? What will they think? Have I done the right thing to do this?" And then the angel said, "You go to the church offices in the morning. They will be waiting for you." Accordingly, Torleif Kanapus met the brethren the next day, and they unanimously chose one of the sketches. Unanimously. The exact same one pointed to by the angel. And not only that, Torleif was commissioned to begin the work that would take him the next 5 years of his life. Now, he needed to begin with a model. Someone to sculpt. He needed a model. Well, he found that model in the physique of a young bricklayer by the name of Elwyn Clark, who had done some work for him. Elwyn evidently had the musculature that Torleif thought was just right. But as he went to work, he felt that the face was too young for Moroni. He fasted and he prayed for help. Then one day, he was walking in downtown Salt Lake City, and he saw a man who struck him as the perfect model. He followed the guy, and he studied his features. Satisfied, finally, he approached the man and asked him if he would be willing to model for this unique sculpture. Turns out, the man was a rancher from Wyoming who had recently moved back to Salt Lake City. The man agreed, and together they walked together back to Torleif's studio, which wasn't that far away. They walked in. Elwyn Clark was still there. Can you imagine Torleif's surprise when the 2 men knew each other? In fact, the older gentleman's name was Hiram Don Carlos Clark, Elwyn Clark's father. The monument was dedicated July 21st, 1935 by President Heber J. Grant. I love to go there. Each time I look up at that beautiful statue, I am reverentially reminded, first, of the sacred events of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, of Moroni and the prophet Joseph Smith, and the miracle of translation of the Book of Mormon and deliverance. But secondly, I'm reminded of the miracle of the monument itself, designed by revelation, chosen by an angel, and modeled by a miracle. Now, we will go from the Hill Cumorah to the Smith farm. And there's a lot of stories at the Smith farm, especially the Sacred Grove, the first vision, coming of Moroni, all of that. But there's one story that is not told often. But in terms of revelation, it is oh so significant and meaningful. It was just before Christmas in 1835. The prophet Joseph Smith went to a scheduled debate at the home of his brother William. During the course of the evening's events, things got a little heated between the participants. Joseph interceded and commented that such behavior was not becoming of the men involved. Well, Joseph's brother William became angry and then turned violent. It turned into a fight between the prophet Joseph and his enraged brother William. In the end, Joseph was sorely injured and the Smith family was torn into factions. They chose up sides. In the days that followed, letters passed back and forth between Joseph and William. In one of those letters at the very end, Joseph wrote this most tender prayer. And now may God have mercy upon my father's house. May God take away enmity from between me and thee, and may all blessings be restored, and the past be forgotten forever. May humble repentance bringeth both to thee, O God, and to thy power and protection and a crown, to enjoy the society of father, mother, and Alvin. Note it. Joseph prayed to be with Alvin in the eternities. And therein lies a beautiful story. Alvin was the oldest living child of Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack. He was a noble and obedient son, faithful to his family and to his God. And then unexpectedly and suddenly, November the 19th, 1823, there in Palmyra at the Smith farm, Alvin suddenly passed away, leaving his family shocked and stricken with grief. Mother Smith wrote, "We all with one accord wept over our irretrievable loss. We could not be comforted because he was not." End of quote. At his funeral, many friends and neighbors paid their respects, not the least of which was the lovely girl that Alvin was engaged to marry. Alvin was much loved, respected, and missed. However, the minister who preached the funeral sermon hinted that Alvin had gone to hell because he had never been baptized. Well, that comment deeply hurt and offended the family, especially Joseph Smith Sr. It opened up a wound in the soul of Joseph Jr. that he would carry for the rest of his days. "I remember well," Joseph Jr. said, "the pangs of sorrow that swelled my youthful bosom and almost burst my tender heart when he died." End of quote. Yet Alvin had died, not baptized, not a member of any Christian church. And so the question, would Alvin be saved, or was he indeed everlastingly damned to hell? From 1823 to 1836, this question must have torn at Joseph's soul. His prayer that he and William could be together with Alvin in the next life represented a profound search for consolation. Imagine then the rest of the story. The joy of the night I just told you. January 21st, 1836, on the third floor attic story of the Kirtland Temple in Joseph Smith's office on the West End. It was a night of glorious visions, heavenly manifestations for Joseph and for many others. And I can't tell you the whole of it, but in the course of that night, there was one vision, perhaps more significant for more people than any other. There on the third floor of the Kirtland Temple, Joseph said, "The heavens were opened upon us, and I beheld the celestial kingdom of God and the glory thereof. Whether in the body or out, I cannot tell." Joseph then saw the Father and the Son enthroned in glory. He saw the ancient patriarchs. And then, as the vision continued, he said, "I saw my father and mother and my brother Alvin that has long since slept." Well, how could that be? How could he see Alvin in the celestial kingdom? Clearly, and moreover, he saw his father in the celestial kingdom, but his father was in the room with him. Well, in answer to that question, the voice of the Lord came to Joseph. Quote, "All who have died without a knowledge of this gospel, who would have received it if they'd been permitted to tarry, shall be heirs of the celestial kingdom of God. For I, the Lord, will judge all men according to their works, according to the desires of their hearts." End of quote. Alvin represented all the righteous dead of all the ages. He would be saved even though he had not heard the gospel in this life. He and all the rest, they will be saved. 2 months later, the power to do so was fulfilled. Elijah appeared in that same temple and restored the keys of the sealing power. And in Nauvoo, Illinois, August 15th, 1840, upon hearing the doctrine of baptism for the dead revealed, the weakened and enfeebled Father Joseph Smith Sr. requested that the work for Alvin be immediately done. He was baptized by proxy in the Mississippi River. From tragedy in Palmyra to triumph in Nauvoo. One of the places we will visit, and I so love going there, is the Martin Harris Farm, just north of Palmyra. And of course, we'll go to the Grandin Press, and there are many stories I'm going to tell there, but I don't have time to tell you all of them. So I'll just tell you this one from the Martin Harris Farm. Here we go. He was a man raised up for a singular purpose, called and chosen to assist in bringing forth the Book of Mormon. Martin Harris came from a family of English Quakers who immigrated to Palmyra, New York at the end of the 18th century. They settled on 600 acres just north of the Palmyra town site and turned it into some of the best farmland in the area. Well, Martin married his first cousin, Lucy Harris, and together they raised a family. By 1825, though, the marriage between Martin and Lucy was in sufficient difficulty that they legally separated and divided their property and moved into separate households. They didn't divorce, but everything but that. They continued amicable association, at least as far as possible. That's 1825. Now, Joseph Smith received a revelation through the Urim Thummim that Martin was to be the man to assist in bringing forth the Book of Mormon. Hence, in the summer of 1829, when the Book of Mormon was about to be printed, 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon for the price of $3,000, it was Martin Harris who stepped forward and offered his farm, his portion of it, as collateral for the printing. Now, in the day, that was a fortune. And no one but Martin had the faith and the means to support such an undertaking. Well, what must have gone through Martin's mind on that date, August 25th, 1829, when he signed the agreement with Egbert B. Grandin, that Grandin would print the Book of Mormon, and if book sales did not sufficiently compensate Grandin, then Martin would sell his farm to pay the debt. Now, mind you, Martin Harris had built one of the most coveted farms in all of Palmyra. He was a prosperous and well-respected member of the community. And now, all of that was on the line. A book. For a book. His farm was mortgaged to Grandin. And not only that, his reputation, once sterling, now hung entirely on Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. Well, now, March of 1830, the Book of Mormon came off the presses. Book sales would surely square that debt, and Martin would keep the farm. That was his anxious and earnest desire. However, picture this. Joseph Smith is riding into Palmyra in a carriage, and he sees a man up ahead of him with his arms loaded with books. Upon drawing close, he discovers it's Martin Harris, his arms loaded with copies of the Book of Mormon, going throughout the community soliciting sales. But the angry, hard-hearted citizens of Palmyra held true to their threatened boycott, and the books didn't sell. And it was becoming plainly evident to Martin that this endeavor would cost him his life's work. Finally, February 1831, the agreement came due, and Martin Harris sold that family farm to his friend, Thomas Lakey, for $3,000. History hasn't been particularly kind to Martin Harris. You know why. But you can say whatever you like. Martin willingly paid for the Book of Mormon. And by that sacrifice, he obtained a faith in that book that lasted the rest of his life. Joseph the Seer translated it. Oliver Cowdery wrote it down. But what of their work if no one would have been able to read it? Think for a moment of the good those first 5,000 books accomplished. They brought an entire generation to the Savior and his restored gospel. And just one of those books now, in good shape, is worth more than all that Martin originally paid for the lot. Martin could not have known it at the time. He gave his land for a legacy, and his reputation among men for a reputation in heaven. As long as the Book of Mormon continues to bring men to worship the risen Christ, the name of Martin Harris, special witness, will be held in eternal respect, honor, and gratitude. Now, my friends, this is a sample of some of the stories that I will be sharing along the way on this tour. I go nonstop with 90 people for 12 days, showing them all the places of our sacred history and telling them stories like these. The beauty of a tour like this is that the people come with me have the opportunity to immerse themselves, not only in the places, but in the history. They get to see and feel at the same time. And they carry those memories with them forever. There will be more stories that I will share with you as we move further west on the tour. But for now, this is Glenn Rawson.